On this week's episode of NYC Round,
we have Eric Friedman and Sam Huleatt. Eric was an investor at Union Square Ventures. He invested in and led business development at Foursquare, and now he powers VCs as a fractional CFO and COO. Sam is a two-time startup founder, and he's a seasoned angel investor who backed companies at OnDeck, Primary Ventures, and now Intangible Ventures. In this episode, we dive into pivotal moments in the history of NYC tech, what Sam and Eric have learned from years operating and investing in startups, and how New York can finally take the crown as the startup capital of the world. Hope you enjoy.
Eric, Sam, thanks for joining us. A few weeks ago, I tweeted just asking people, I wanted to go on a deep dive of New York City tech history, and I asked, who are the people I should speak to? You two were folks that many people mentioned. So first of all, thank you for gracing us with your presence. I'm excited to talk to you both.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course.
It just means we're old.
Yeah. Well, we'll see based on your answers to certain questions. Tell us a little bit each, first you, Eric, about your history in the NYC tech ecosystem. What have you built? What have you been a part of?
So I am a New Yorker from the start, born and raised here. And so I'm very supportive of New York City. I have been doing early stage investing and startup operating for about 15 years. I started my career in the institutional VC world, worked over to the startup side of things, and then have always been either in an allocator seat, building an accelerator, or working with and around founders and startups.
I think you were at USV, Foursquare as well.
I did start my venture career at Union Square Ventures, which would be interesting to get into, but it was through my writing and posting online that I met them, and they found me, and I worked there for a couple of years. And then we invested in another New York startup called Foursquare, and I went over there when it was a handful of people, and then went to a place called Expa, which was a startup studio that also began their accelerator program, which I ran. And then I went out on my own to start doing fractional COO consulting. Connected again with another accelerator and built from scratch to invested companies and Delaware C Corps at OnDeck Accelerator, which was known as ODX. It's actually where Sam and I came back together. We invested about $37 million into 150 or so companies. Wow. And that led to working really closely with founders, supporting them, investing in them, and now doing consulting again, mainly for VCs and accelerators.
And then Sam, you're a really prominent angel investor today, but what about Sam of the last, 10 or so years?
Yeah. And I kind of, I guess, sort of the opposite of Eric, who kind of went from, investor to operator. I kind of did the opposite. So I spent the earlier part of my career kind of building companies. I did a B2B SaaS company called WorkStreamer. It was kind of split between New York City and Austin. We raised some money from Austin Ventures. At the time, New York didn't have as many sort of, early stage investors. So we kind of had to look elsewhere. Had a small exit with that company, and then ended up bootstrapping a company in the ad tech space called Heights Media. Started, angel investing pretty heavily, ended up doing a couple of different roles. And so now I'm spending a lot of time with emerging managers. So do some work with two different emerging manager accelerator programs, and then still actively angel invest as well.
Got it. So very active in the NYC ecosystem for quite a while. And, we'll get into the periods you were active earlier in your careers, but even before that, you're students of the game. Where does the story of NYC tech, where are the beginning moments for you? What is the chapter one here for you both? Let's start with you, Eric.
For me, when I was in college, I actually came home and over the summer worked at a startup in the early .com boom days, although we didn't know it at the time. And I thought that was a really interesting way to understand what it was like to work on a really small team, work on a really interesting problem, and it turns out burn through a whole bunch of money without a business plan. And this company asked me to drop out of school and join the company. Thank goodness I didn't, but that was the sort of introduction and vibe that I got from the sort of underdog company that wants to go and take over the world. And I thought that was really interesting. And there was no ecosystem. This was 1998, 1999, and then 2000, 2001 period. That was my first foray into, hey, this is a startup, which I don't think anyone had the vernacular vocabulary to describe. And
right, why on that? Why?
I think people knew a few success stories that grew to be monolithic companies, but no one had this idea of, hey, we can fund a team that's building a new piece of software that will then be used by millions. Like, it's easy to tell that story in hindsight,
Right.
but the idea that you could do this was made possible by the public markets saying, we want access to these kind of companies, which led to a lot of money being put into the companies. And then those companies bringing themselves to market through IPOs, and the hype really growing and then really blowing up because there was no business model. There were no customers. There was no like demonstrable revenue source. But the idea was that you could replicate like an Apple or Microsoft, and you could do that in a new place with like a new paradigm, and people could get access and ownership of it, which, much like today, turns out to be totally wrong unless you have a revenue model.
That makes sense. So you join a startup early, then what happens?
I was in college, so I did not drop out. I did not take that job. When I graduated, my first job was actually at a advertising company. And that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me. It was WPP. It was one of their sub-agencies. And the landscape of what was going on in media, meaning TV, out-of-home, radio, and what was called interactive, was immediately apparent to me that this is going to go away. And the reason for that was TV watching habits, newspapers, Craigslist, like tracking and analytics with like radio and out of home. There was just nothing that existed.
Right.
And it very quickly showed me that getting out of a dinosaur industry would be a good idea and into something that was actually monetizable, trackable, and actually building towards the future, which was in that day and age, which was like 2004, 2005 search marketing,
Yeah.
which was intent-based, trackable, driving customers to something.
It's a new channel.
It was a new channel, but when you look back and say, imagine a customer looking for a thing, what better way to put relevant and affinity-based links in front of them than a search query, right? If you're searching for something, chances are you're interested in that thing. So if you put something adjacent to it to open their horizons, which is PPC advertising, that's a great model. And so that was the drift and call to me away from TV and radio and banners and all that kind of advertising.
It's opening up more opportunities for individuals in that era, more opportunities to scale businesses, to collect customers, that sort of thing.
Well, I think it made sense. And what's most interesting is that not everyone agreed, because there were systems in place that supported ad buying and ad planning and these budgets and these RFPs and frequency and reach of TV. Don't forget, it was like, hey, let's advertise on primetime. That's how we're going to reach our customers.
I mean, journalism is struggling with that still. Okay, so that makes sense. So the dot-com boom is like where you would start, the modern era. How about you, Sam?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I wasn't exactly here for it, but I tend to think of early foundations of New York tech being around the dot-com boom, right? And a lot of sort of irrational exuberance, companies that like Cosmo.com, I think we were talking about a while back, or, GeoCities, which I think did really well in the public markets, but then ended up kind of crashing. I think there were a lot of great, founders at that time to kind of set the stage for what, New York tech is today. I remember kind of early on watching this documentary that I think was created by a guy named Josh Harris called We Live in Public. And I think Jason Calacanis, this guy, Jeff Doshis, who started Razorfish, who I ended up doing some work with my first company, WorkStreamer, were featured prominently in that. And I think it's interesting, I was going back and just watching some clips of it, and just to see sort of like the exuberance, but also the, how fragile sort of the ecosystem was. And I think it was the point where for the first time, kind of people were willing to kind of coming out of, the dot-com crash and almost into, the financial crisis, where people were willing to sort of depart a high-paying Wall Street job and maybe, take a risk with starting a company. And so I think a lot of really foundational stuff kind of, was set at that period, including folks like Kevin Ryan, who, did DoubleClick. I think DoubleClick IPO'd in maybe like 2008, so kind of toward the end of that era. But
what did DoubleClick's IPO mean for New York City at that time? Like,
I think it really legitimized a lot of things. It kind of meant that, hey, New York is capable of having, great engineering talent, I think, who kind of comes off Wall Street, but can, build in sort of like more of the startup mentality. And also, New York's capable of producing meaningful, venture capital exits. I mean, I think DoubleClick, had kind of a wild story where it was bought and sold a few different times, but ultimately, I think it was one of the big first wins that really gave investors confidence in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think we had a few social networks, if I think about that era. Well, let me back up. The idea of investing in browser software, services and businesses that could exist in the software layer of the internet was like an original thesis of USV. And you saw that manifest itself in services like Facebook, services like Twitter, services like Foursquare. So what does the fabric of using these services, even every day in a phone, don't forget, like there was no app store. There was a smartphone, which then had an app store, which then had apps. Mm-hmm. No one had thought of or considered this paradigm. Like people were switching off of Blackberries. I know myself was included in that. I don't know if you ever used
Oh, yeah, of course.
Which was great. Keyboard on the phone, email, what more could you possibly need? And the answer is constant communication with friends, checking pictures and feeds, and then, of course, checking in, right, with Foursquare. And the big question, which I think was raised and then subsequently answered, is how does it make money? How does it become a business? And what came out of that era was this idea of native advertising. We know and love today that you could have a promoted post on Facebook, right? A promoted tweet. In Foursquare, there was a series of ads. And the idea was that you took the network and you took the people and the action in the network and actually turned that into the atomic unit of something people were comfortable with so they could see it and feel it. And if you think back to what I just mentioned before, a paid search ad looks exactly like or an organic search result, except it just says ad next to it. The same thing is true, but I think at the time no one knew, and they were just investing in hyper growth. And one of the things that came out of it is if you have an audience and you have people using a network, the business model will come later. And that was part of the investment thesis. And I think what a lot of people were after, which is like, have the network, have the people. If they're spending time there, you can figure out how to monetize it later.
Got it. That makes sense. We'll dig into Foursquare a little bit more a little later on. And then Sam, from your perspective, like what other like institutional organizations like help power New York City into the next step? Like I think of like maybe Google, but what other entities? Hey, before we get to their answer, I want to take a quick second to just thank everybody that's been a part of the NYC round journey so far. If you've enjoyed these conversations we've been having with investors and founders, like, subscribe, and comment down below. Now back to the conversation.
I think one of the things for me that jumps out of that like kind of next era is definitely like focus on Web 2.0, social, mobile, right? And for me, I think that was kind of where I was really getting kind of indoctrinated into the ecosystem. And I kind of like to think of it in a fun way as like the heyday of New York tech. I think there's just a lot of energy.
What years were this specifically? It was,
I would say probably, 2006, call it, I don't know, 2018 or something like that. But, I mean, I think one of the things that jumped out to me of that era was just this kind of like energy or vibe, right? Of a lot of people coming together. There were, there was like meetup.com, there was like New York Tech, there was a really cool thing called Hackers and Founders where people were routinely getting together, kind of around Madison Square Park. And, I think Chris Pike from like Thrive was really active at that time. And, there's just a lot of energy in the city. And I think companies like, Foursquare was like a really exciting, kind of, brand and, almost like movement, I feel like in New York. And the other thing about it was I feel like that era was where it kind of became a little bit more popular to become a founder. So you had a lot of awesome folks who probably otherwise had been 5-6 years before, might have just done consulting or financing. I think about like Alexa Von Tobel or like Sam Lessin, who was doing Dropio at that time. Really smart people who, their first thought was, hey, I want to start a company. And do it in New York. So, I just kind of think of that era as a lot of energy. But it was also, I think, where, to your point, or a question around, the organizations and stuff, I think, the foundation was really set for early investing activity. So you had a lot of the key funds, who really powered the ecosystem kind of get off the ground, everyone from like Primary Ventures to Notation Capital, Larer, Box Group. So it was a time where I think there was just a lot of energy, a lot of activity Techstars, kind of started, I guess, before Box. David Tisch was kind of running that.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just felt like there was a real opportunity for people to build really interesting, meaningful companies here in New York.
I'll add another one, which is David Karp building Tumblr.
Yeah.
In New York, that was such a pivotal moment where the zeitgeist was captured by a new media-esque platform that was publishing in a new way. I don't know if you ever used it or saw it.
Yep.
And that was just such an interesting group of people that felt connected because they weren't publishing in like the traditional way. And it was almost like blogging and then Tumblr. And if you knew about it, you knew about it. And maybe the only thing I can think of is like Snapchat of today.
Yeah.
Like remember when it came out, people weren't
My
sure.
first year in college came out, and there was a fervor over it because it's like it's different.
And it was almost like a gatekeeping moment. Like if you knew what it was and how to use it, you were on the inside.
Right.
And we all know it's not that complicated, but there was this barrier.
Yeah.
I think the same is true for Tumblr and the people, communities, and sort of what developed around it.
Absolutely. I think there was also kind of just more transparency that was coming into startups in general. And so that era, it's hard not to think of, like Fred Wilson's blog, which kind of became like this almost like, real active community online. And, then when sort of, I think people were doing meetups, but, I think sort of Fred being willing to, put a lot of content and, thought leadership out there, really opened the door for a lot of people to learn about venture capital, learn about startups, and, feel a little bit more comfortable taking that jump or, risk.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Yeah, when I interviewed Ben at Primary Ventures, one thing he mentioned is like financial crisis, horrible thing that happened, but it sort of gave folks that were brilliant minds in finance the permission to like break into tech and like build really strong companies. At the same time, I'm hearing like a picture of like, other than USB and a few others, like there's just no investment here during certain years here in New York. Like you mentioned in your story earlier, like having to go to another city because there wasn't anything there. There's a lot of excitement, but like, what was limiting that excitement? Was it the ability to raise funds? Like, what was the environment back then if you were a startup founder and wanted to raise money to build a company here?
One, I think up until that point, there hadn't been a lot of big outcomes. And, we might talk about this a little bit later, but, one of the things that has really propelled Silicon Valley, right, is just this, turnover, so you have a really successful outcome of the company. And then those employees go on to start their own companies to become, angel investors, right? And that capital and goodwill kind of gets recycled into the ecosystem. And there just hadn't been that much of that in New York. And so I think, you just didn't have as many sort of early stage angels and that sort of thing. So I think that was a big piece of it.
I mean, as a founder, you need capital, you need great people, and then from an investor perspective, you need outcomes. And so a lot of the stuff is externalities, and that dislocation of talent, I think in 2008, gave people the freedom to say, hey, I need to figure something else out, or I want to figure something else out. And then some of these exits made people comfortable with the potential path. And then investors were aware, hey, this is an area we can put dollars into. I think about another firm, First Round Capital in New York, like putting their flag down, Chris Fralick, and a couple other guys for what they built, really being able to invest and support businesses that maybe didn't look like or feel like other businesses in New York, but that's been startups since the beginning.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point, I think. I mean, when I was raising capital for my first company, I remember there was definitely a feeling that, if you were building something that was a little bit different in the sense of it wasn't, what we now call like a fintech company or some sort of like very specific vertical, SaaS type company, that it was going to be really hard to get money. Like if you were making a big bet on something, you kind of needed to go to the West Coast. And I think having a few of those other, someone like a First Round, if it was coming into New York saying, hey, we're willing to back those really ambitious founders, even if they're building something that maybe is not the traditional New York company, a media company or something, being willing to make those bets, I think really changed the ecosystem for the better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there other factors that you think have contributed to New York's ability to evolve over the last like 15, 20 years into, I would say, like solidly number two, potentially, hopefully vying for number one in a couple of years? But
I think the community of people that want to support each other, it's a big West Coast thing, which is to give back, to go to the next generation, to support. Answering a cold email from someone when you're an established founder and giving back was a very San Francisco, West Coast, Palo Alto thing. I think now you have enough people who can do that here and want to start the next thing, you know, we sort of, it sounds great, and it, you know, we know about the outcomes of great companies, but it's a very lonely thing when you're building, especially as a founder, especially as an early team. You know, even with dollars, it's really hard to recruit, right? And that's always been the case. These are like evergreen statements for 20 years. But when you have a group of people in a room hacking away at a problem, it can be pretty desolate and pretty lonely. And this idea of like two people building something in a garage is great because we have this big like fairy tale story. But when you're next door to a hedge fund and a media company and a fashion company that's all growing, and it's a very different experience. And now there's camaraderie. It's like shoulder to shoulder with other people who are grinding and building. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, makes sense. I'd also say, you know, I think sort of proximity and, you know, kind of talent density also matters a lot. Yeah. And I think you had mentioned this earlier, but, you know, during that era, you know, Google opened a really substantial engineering office here. Facebook came into town, again, you know, brought in lots of engineering talent. And so I think the natural thing was a lot of those folks will kind of, you know, work for, you know, the kind of corporate folks for a bit, and then, you know, they kind of get that entrepreneurial bug and spin out. And so I think, you know, one, you know, the, you know, Googles and Facebooks of the world kind of coming into town really, you know, further legitimize things, but then also, you know, help, you know, really create a solid bedrock of, you know, engineering talent here in the city, and many of whom went on to start, you know, great companies here.
That makes sense. It's something I've experienced firsthand in my hometown, like just north of Raleigh. Like when I was a kid, Raleigh wasn't this like massive destination for families that it is today. And I look at the steps that made that possible, and it was Apple, IBM, Google moving down there. Like it's sort of like that was the institution that allowed more people to invest in that area. Now it's the Research Triangle, and there's a lot of folks moving down there.
If you think about the construct of people no longer working 30 years in one place and getting a gold watch and retiring, if you bring that to, well, how long did they work there? 2 to 4 years, maybe. Where do they go right after that? Where do they go in 2 years? Where do they go in 6 years? And I think you need that kind of, you know, ability to go to the next place. And that's what some of these companies afforded people to do, even from the old like 1.0 or like corporate world, to go to the first generation tech companies. Yeah. And then those big tech companies to give them the runway to go start something on their own.
Got it. One thing I'm curious about, you guys were both, so you were operating as a you know, founder at the time, raising money. You were on the other side, like hearing founders pitch you at USV. Can you paint the picture for like a first-time founder today here in New York? How much has changed for the better or for worse? You know, speaking to a founder who may be frustrated right now with the fundraising process, where are things better today, or how are they harder for the founder?
Well, I'll pick on more recent examples because those other days were further back. In the 2 accelerators that I've personally run and deployed capital from, first time around was at Expo. We saw thousands of applications. Second time around at OnDeck, we saw like 10,000 applications. So when you think about just the volume of people who are starting companies, that's increased. I think the transparency, which started with some venture firms blogging, this was like a novel concept, and putting these things out there. You have more resources, you have more playbooks, literal books that are published, but then also blog posts, and now video, and now podcasts. And so you have like frameworks, and people have laid the tracks, and then it's time to like run the trains. And so one major difference is people have an idea of what happens in that primordial soup moment to build something, and they can start to pull those pieces together. And one thing that's similar is the questions remain the same. So if you look at any of these templates or deck things, or, you know, whatever you put together, who's the team? What are you building? Is it clear enough for me to tell a partner who wasn't in the room? What's the business model? Or if you haven't figured it out yet, why? What's the big vision for this company? What market are you going after? This is a total addressable market question. These questions are the same from last year, from 5 years ago, from 20 years ago, and then I'm assuming from 30, 40 years ago. Now there's ways to articulate those stories and show progress. I think that's one of the big things where, you know, the order of magnitude cost to get to a V1 goes down like exponentially every 10 years. And so if you think about what that means, a pre-seed, or whatever the synonym might be for that day, whatever's on the deal doc, doesn't really matter. A company that hasn't raised any money can come to the market with an incredible MVP or product, and maybe even some users, before anything is even created. And if you even thought about that 10, 15 years ago, I think it would cost you, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to get to that point, to then get to a beta, to then put it in front of a customer. And now the tools and services are there, so someone can do that, in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric covered the kind of main points there. But, I think about the first time I raised capital, I had never seen a term sheet until I got issued one, right? So I think a lot of founders today just are armed with so much more information, right? And it really creates an incredible sort of advantage. The other thing is, I think to Eric's point around, just it's so much easier to sort of get something off the ground, to get an MVP out there. I think that also has really helped because it gives angel investors a lot more confidence, right? If you show up and you just kind of show somebody a PowerPoint, you're really expecting them to take like a major leap on sort of like the risk spectrum, right? As opposed to now, you can kind of show up with a product that's already got some traction in the market, maybe is producing some revenue. And so I think it opens, the doors for a much wider population of potential angel investors. So yeah, those are a couple of things that really jump out to me.
As I was thinking about this and your question just sparked this in my head, I think there's also a whole series of questions that founders are now armed with and ready to ask their investors. And I'll give you a few, which I think are critically important. The reason for being able to ask these questions is there's an asymmetric information set, right? The power dynamic. Mm-hmm. Investors have been through this term sheet process multiple times. Usually a founder, it's their first, maybe second time if they're lucky. And now some of these questions a founder can ask an investor is something like, where in the fund cycle are you? Do you have funds? Is this the last investment in the fund? What does the process look like? Who do you have to go back to figure out if you can make the investment, whether it's title or ability or all these other things that really matter? Are you planning on making an investment in my category, in my sector in the next 3 months?
Yeah.
More importantly, are you planning on investing in my company?
Right.
What is your process? Right? This was this black box that no one knew. I come in, maybe I present, there's some people, spinning a pen. I'm not really sure where I am. Now founders are running a CRM, they're writing a memo, they're looking at analytics for who looked at their deck and how much time did you spend on a slide. I think they're armed with the questions they can ask an investor. And then through all these resources Sam described, you know what you're going to see in a term sheet. Right. You know what questions get asked by programs. You know what interview prep looks like for some of these accelerators. And I think that training ground yields better founders and pushes people to be better investors, which makes the ecosystem stronger.
But one point I just want to double click on, Sam, you're an angel investor in founders today. There must be moments or themes you hear when you're listening to a founder pitch you where you're like, man, if this was when I was trying to pitch folks, like Eric, you guys have it easy today. What are those things?
I mean, I think it just goes back to some of what we described before. I mean, I routinely am helping, founders with additional intros to angel investors. I mean, it was when I was raising capital for my first company, it was pulling teeth to try and find somebody, right, who was an active angel investor, or even if they were an active angel investor, they may not, just have that sort of industry knowledge that I feel is a little bit more commonplace. You had a lot of, the few angel investors that existed in New York, a lot of them were a Wall Street person, right, who was just wanting to kind of support the community, as opposed to Silicon Valley, where you had a lot of former operators, right, who had started and sold a company, right, and so they had that sort of additional institutional knowledge and operational domain expertise and that sort of thing, which you just have so much more of now. Now founders have almost the luxury, right, of being able to say, hey, I want to build, this really amazing investor syndicate for my company. And I only want investors, right, who have this incredible product experience or are relevant to my fintech in this particular way. In that just kind of vibrant ecosystem of specific types of investors and talent just didn't exist back then.
What in your mind, it can be New York specific, doesn't have to be, what, theses have, investors had or startup founders had that ended up being correct, 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. I kind of think about it maybe more from the investor standpoint, so what was the thesis that a VC fund like a Notation Capital or a Primary Venture Partners, needed to have at the time to say, hey, we really want to put a stake in the ground here in New York and primarily back New York City founders. And I think it was one, a belief that technical talent was going to want to come be in New York City. And, Eric and I are probably, and probably you as well, are biased, but I think New York City is one of the best places in the world to live, right? And so ultimately, it's a great place to be, and technical talent would want to be here. Two, that meaningful companies could be built and, venture outcomes could be realized. That was definitely a bet that was being made. With those successful outcomes, kind of back to my point from before, it's like capital is going to be recycled into the ecosystem. There were going to be great founders who are spinning out of a company like a DoubleClick, right, wanting to start something on their own. And there was going to need to be early stage capital to back them. And I think for the most part, all of those, theses have played out. To some extent, maybe New York is still like waiting for, the next, Google or something to come out of this ecosystem. But I think on the whole, like we don't necessarily need that. And we've proven that, there can be really, sizable outcomes that can, return funds.
So like the Tumblr exit, I think, Flatiron Health, ZocDoc was here.
Yeah.
Am I hearing that those didn't quite recycle as much as like what you would expect from a Bay Area exit?
Yeah, I mean, I think Flatiron Health did, but that's, I would say, kind of a newer company.
Yeah.
So if I go back to like a 2005 or something, when some of these, or maybe even a little bit earlier, when some of these first kind of core New York City funds started, there was DoubleClick, but there really hadn't been a lot of others. And even if you were to go back, I've been an investor in a couple of New York City funds, and I think back to like some of the companies that would be cited in like those, pitch decks to potential LPs. At the time, the exciting companies, maybe like a MakerBot or something, which I believe did have, an exit, but I don't know if it was like the type of exit that people had really hoped for,
right.
Even like a Foursquare, which again has been a very successful company. But I think, some of the early hype was, these can be the next, Google or Facebook or something like that. And so it's interesting that like some of the companies that would have been top of mind back then as like the leading companies of the era maybe didn't end up panning out, but then other ones, Flatiron Health, kind of comes to mind where those end up being like the real sort of like darlings.
I think that they did, and it had a huge impact. And there's this idea in venture of like singles, doubles, and home runs and grand slams. I think of a couple companies. One is like GroupMe by Jared Hecht and Steve Martucci, and like, it was an outcome, again, reportedly something like $50 or $100 million or something. And it enabled VCs to see and give room to run for these smaller companies, or, that's a huge outcome.
Yeah.
And then there's companies people haven't really heard of because they're more B2B, but it's like single platform. Kenny Herman and the contingent there, which sold again for like a reported amount in that range. I think that yielded a ton of angel investors, a ton of operators. He's a founder again, and I think it did allow those things to happen. The entire group that came out of the Tumblr acquisition, both on the operator side and the investor side, I just think it gave room to run for these ideas and companies that were a little more outside the typical, Wall Street or IPO outcome-based companies.
That's a great point. And the other thing too is a lot of the big outcomes on the West Coast, right, had offices in New York. And so you actually had, indirectly a lot of people getting, wealthy off of West Coast outcomes, but able to like redeploy the capital in New York. Think of companies like MoPub, a good friend of mine, Kevin Weatherman's an incredibly active, angel investor who, had kind of made some money, right, in that one. Or, I think about Uber, right? Like New York was an absolutely critical market for them, and they had a huge team here, all of whom did, exceptionally well. And many of them, have gone on to start companies, to be really active angels, start funds here. So I think, we also benefited in some ways from, great West Coast outcomes as, it kind of became a little bit more, you had to have an office in New York.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said about this idea of a thesis. And everyone has to have one, but it reminds me of like the trainer quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. These are stories for the LPs.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are you going to do? And they have this amazing thing. If you look at the portfolio of every VC firm, there's an outlier, meaning we don't invest in hardware. Oh yeah, except that one company.
Right.
Or yeah, we don't do deals in this sector. Oh, well, this was a second time founder who we backed before, and she had this outcome, and we would love to back them again. What I think about that idea It's like when people say, I have a framework. It's like, you mean a thought? Yes. And I saw this, out there. It's kind of funny. And then a thesis, I think about the ones that didn't work. And one of them that comes to mind is this idea of conversational commerce. Do you guys remember this? It was this idea of the layer of the internet which you would want to chat and interact with in a conversation with, let's say, a store or a retailer or something like that. Now, fast forward to today, we're on the brink of that because there's a smart enough agent, large language model that might make that possible.
Yeah.
But that entire layer that invested in conversational commerce turned out to be completely wrong. But it sounds really smart. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great to deal with a store on a one-to-one basis with you, your needs, and your tastes, giving you everything that you could possibly imagine at any time of day? Again, talk tracks that don't turn into a viable business.
Right.
So that's a thesis that existed with multiple firms. Like, what's your approach to conversational commerce? And then we'd have this back and forth, and it turned out to be nothing.
Yeah, makes sense. One thread I want to pull here, though, I've heard in your answers is many of the companies that you cite are like consumer companies. And there's one element of it where, are there investors in the city? There's excitement of exits. But like, would you say that for a city to develop in the way that a Bay Area has, it's essential that the majority of the companies that are having these massive exits are ones like Snapchat, like Uber, that are consumer oriented?
I don't think so, but I think it's helpful,
yeah.
Right? Because I think the consumer companies are much more visible, right? They've got a lot of end user excitement around them typically, so word of mouth is important. But yeah, I mean, to your point, right, probably a lot of the most meaningful exits in New York in a lot of ways have been, kind of either boring companies or companies that people don't exactly know how to explain, like a DoubleClick, right? Or, a Bison Trails,
AppNexus,
some of these more like infrastructure type companies.
MongoDB.
MongoDB is a great example. I mean, those companies have been absolutely crucial to the growth of the ecosystem. But I do think, even a company that, a Foursquare, a company like that, right, which maybe hasn't at least yet had as big an outcome, is still so critical just because it creates that sort of energy around, just getting involved in startups in tech.
So speaking of Foursquare, can you give us the Foursquare story? You invested in them first, then you led as their first go-to-market sales leader. Tell me what happened to Foursquare for those that may not be aware, and where does Instagram play a role here?
Well, Foursquare is a way to digitally raise your hand and say, I'm at this place. It was called a check-in, which was an adopted nomenclature now across many different apps. And what that turned into was a location data service that could be used to power and figure out many other things. And so I'd say that's maybe the transition from a B2C company to a B2B company. Mm-hmm. But the big takeaway for me, and this was from the early days of an app called Bourbon, which no one had heard about, which transitioned to Instagram, which I think a few people have heard about, is this idea of embracing behavior versus creating behavior. And in Foursquare's case, we created this behavior, which was pretty cool because Sam and I could meet up at a bar if we saw on our smartphone that we were both at that place. But one of the things you don't do first is digitally raise your hand to say I'm at this place. And if you think about Instagram in the early days, one of the things that a lot of people do is take a picture. Mm-hmm. After the fact, we might tag each other in that picture. We might add the place to that picture. We might leave a comment, hey, that was awesome. And if you start with the atomic unit being that something that people do and then add on to that, that's a much better plan, embracing that existing behavior than creating a behavior. And so another semi-New York company, which sparks to mind, is Venmo.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Ikram and Cortina, building that business brick by brick. I remember going out and hustling to get people on it. People would say for years and pitch things like, I'm going to build the next Venmo. People are transacting, buying lunch, still happens today. You know the outcome. And my one question would be, how are you going to get people off of Venmo?
Yeah.
Because there's an existing behavior. And they would paint a picture of a huge vision and what's going to happen once they have 100 million people transacting in this way. But I would always ask, what's the first transaction? And if you think about Instagram, the first picture is already in your phone. Maybe you want to add a filter to it. Maybe you want to add a place to it. But the atomic unit exists. So to get better than that, you've got to be better than the photo you take. To get better than Venmo, you've got to get one person to make a transaction, not in the easiest thing that exists today.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this happens every 3 months with X, where some new social media platform comes up and people are like, we're going this way. And then, all right, we're going back.
That's the cyclical nature of startups, which is so interesting to see over a long period of time. There's this amazing article about the hands of a clock, and every startup has their moment in the spotlight. And then at the bottom, they have their moment just sort of like in the trough of disillusionment. Things couldn't be worse, and it's all over. And then eventually you come out of that.
Yeah.
And
No, I was going to just say, yeah, I think it also highlights just the importance of investing through multiple cycles. I mean, one, quintessential New York fund that we haven't really talked about is like BetaWorks, right? And I just think about in terms of, they were always very thesis-led, and conversational commerce may even have been a key theme of theirs at one point. But, one thing you got to give them a lot of props for is one, bring together a lot of people within the community. But also, they were willing to sort of put a thesis out there, kind of play at the edges of stuff. And, probably a fair number of things didn't work out, but then you just never know what's going to come out of it, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you're willing to sort of embrace these like crazier kind of ideas. But I think it was like their ability, to sort of keep investing through multiple cycles that help ultimately get them into like those types of deals.
What do you think is holding New York City back in terms of factors of it reaching its full potential and becoming the #1 ecosystem for startups?
I'll say that I love it. The chip on the shoulder of being in the second spot is great.
Yeah.
I hope we never get there, because the ambition and gumption behind people saying what you said is huge.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is when you're on the top and you're #1, everybody's coming for you, and you lose that sharpness.
Yeah.
And so I love it. And people who say, hey, we got to get there, and this is what we do. If you think about it, all that verbiage is like take down and negative versus like, hey, we got to get together and be positive.
Yeah.
And so I'm okay in the #2 spot because it keeps me and everybody around me super ambitious.
That's true.
Yeah.
How about you, Sam?
Yeah. I mean, I honestly don't think, New York will ever overtake, the Bay Area. But, I do think, one of the things that can be helpful for New York is, one, is continuing to address affordability, right? That's a problem across the country, and certainly in San Francisco as well. But I think New York in particular is just a very expensive place to raise a family, to build a company. And so the more kind of, programs or, government assistance that can be made available there, I think is really helpful. And then also just continuing to, see, really significant outcomes in the city. And then again, this idea of recycling capital back into the ecosystem, just encouraging more people to become angel investors, advisors, start companies. I think that's just crucial for, continued ecosystem growth. And you do see that, like after the Flatiron exit, I know, I think Nat and Zach are both doing, some sort of AI grant program. I think they also have a fund separately, so that kind of, contribution back into the ecosystem is awesome to see.
Well, from your founder lens, like what about accelerators and incubators? Because what I often see is that founders are based here in New York, like they like living in New York. They move to the Bay Area to train their language learning models, and then they move back to get their customers.
Yeah.
And how do you keep people here? Like, and it feels like the accelerator incubator, we don't have a YC equivalent in New York that's branded as New York centric.
I mean, more and more there's accelerators that are popping up.
Yeah.
I ran one here. Now you've got South Park Commons, which has a New York office and a whole contingent growing. To put people like that in the same space, amazing things come out of it.
Yeah.
I think BetaWorks did that really well. I think some of these salons and meetups, it's on the right side of cheesy, come together and meet other people who are doing what you're doing, but also meet other people who are not doing what you're doing. Like amazing conversations come from that. I think Techstars put a pretty big flag in the ground. I mean, there's a number of studios, accelerators, and incubators that are supporting people in those interesting ways.
Yeah. And I think it's probably another conversation, but I think in general, the accelerator model is decentralizing a little bit.
Yeah.
It used to be like YC and Techstars, right? Now you've got everything from an HF0 to a NEO to, a lot of funds, right, are running their own accelerator programs. There's Sequoia Arc, and there's a million of them, right? So I do think as more funds continue to come into the city, which a lot of the big West Coast folks now have presence here, we'll see more of those, more early stage accelerator activity just kind of happening naturally.
But you know what I mean? Like, there's no like central figure here in the tech scene that's like running for mayor like there is in the Bay Area. Like, it does seem like that's a lacking ingredient for keeping people here in a feeling of an ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, right, again, it's probably a different kind of conversation, but, having lived in New York for a long time, Eric's, raised a family here, I mean, there are different questions, I think, around how easy is it to feel a sense of community in New York City and to raise a family here, right? And so that probably goes into it a little bit as well. I think there are a lot of people who maybe ultimately go to San Francisco, not because it's, that much better of a place for technology, but maybe they feel it's a better place to raise a family, right? Or easier to, get outdoors and go for a hike or go to the beach, right? And those are things that are challenging to New York, but are also kind of endemic to most, like really major metropolitan areas.
Makes sense. Okay, so switching gears, you're a prominent angel investor today. What did your experience as a founder teach you about angel investing and how to evaluate folks today?
Most major thing that jumps out is just empathy, right, for the founder journey.
Yeah.
Certainly, when you can kind of bring an operator, former operator, founder lens to an investment, I think that can be really helpful. I mean, the number one thing I think for angel investing or folks considering it is, access is just so important.
Yeah.
Right. And everyone from funds to angel investors are always, hyper concerned with this idea of adverse selection, right? Are you seeing the best deals? Right. And I think, when you've been a founder, you've sort of been in the information flow, you have a great network, right? Hopefully. And so if you're seeing, folks that, maybe past employees or, your kind of cohort or peers of other founders, operators starting great companies, right? Then it's kind of like, okay, like I should probably be investing in my friends. And so, I think for me, it was, I really was able to build that network as a founder. And that really has translated into probably a large majority of my investments, right? Have been into investments in folks that I knew, right? And at the earliest stage, often you're just investing in the person. They may have a little bit of traction or something with the product, but at the end of the day, it's a bet on that person, right? And a bet on kind of the future you want to see.
You mean you don't ask for like a 24-month financial model from a...
No. I mean, that's been a whole thing on Twitter, right? And I don't think it's completely wrong to, expect a founder to have some thoughts on how they're going to allocate the capital. But no, you're not typically asking for like a crazy, financial model.
Gotcha. I'm sure you have thoughts.
I have an opinion here. I'm a fan of it, and it's for a simple reason. It's about competency of modeling, not accuracy of prediction.
Well, first for context, why are you a fan of it? It's because you're a fractional COO.
I think mainly my work is with VCs and accelerators. But having worked in and invested in a bunch of early stage companies, it is about portraying the future that you want to see. Right. And many people would argue that I don't need a financial model because it's all made up anyway.
Yeah.
And it's the same reason why, in my opinion, you make your bed in the morning. If you don't want to do that because you're sleeping in at night, what's the point of making it in the first place?
Right.
It's getting organized, it's getting set, and it's the thought process. It's, hey, who are we going to hire and when? Hey, what is it going to cost to run all these services?
Right.
Hey, how much capital, what are we going to do with these proceeds? And so the modeling exercise is more important than the prediction.
Right.
No financial model in the history of the world has been 100% accurate.
Yeah, that makes sense. It just, it shows,
you're either up and to the right or you're down and to the right, and it's over. And that's the important muscle that I think is important to build from the get-go.
I buy that argument. And I heard a recent podcast, I forget which one, but it was it was an investor who made the point that the reason why a lot of marketplace startups got a lot of investment when maybe they shouldn't have is because like 95% of VCs are not accountants.
Yeah.
I'll take that a step further.
Literally the next day, I spoke with a founder who started a marketplace, and he said we couldn't make the labor was too much. I was like, oh my god.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't think through what 3 months or 12 months would look like.
Unit economics matter.
And now more than ever,
Margin,
I would say investors predominantly give terrible product advice. And the reason for that, and the reason why people take it, again, it's that power dynamic. If somebody has tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, you think there's some sort of intelligence difference. When luck plays a role, outcomes play a role. And then also their product experience specifically, at best, is maybe months old, but probably years old.
Yeah.
So their experience And the market factors at that time
Right.
probably don't apply anymore. So you're getting product advice from something that happened 5 years ago.
Gotcha. So what's a sign? Let's assume that access to capital is not a problem. What's a sign that somebody should not get into angel investing?
Should not get into angel investing. I think motivations really matter in angel investing, right? And I think you probably shouldn't get into angel investing if your primary motivation is kind of driven by status or ego. It's cool to have angel investor as a label on your LinkedIn, right? But that's not really a recipe for success. Or, if it's, sense of FOMO, right? It's like, all my friends are angel investing, so I should be angel investing. Again, it kind of comes back to, it's almost like with founders, right? You want somebody who's just, relentlessly focused on something, who's, they're losing sleep over the fact that this thing needs to exist in the world, right? And it's a little bit lesser to an extent with an angel, but, you should really feel like, hey, I have this incredible network of friends and peers who are building meaningful things that I want to be a part of, right?
What about like VC investment in general? What makes somebody cut out for it versus not?
I think VC is a solo game. So you have to be and have the fortitude to probably not have strong managers. I think you got to be able to fly solo. And for the most part, when push comes to shove, you got to be ready to get into a deal when the next firm that you've been, having a friendly relationship with can't.
Right.
And that's what matters. And so that's what we were talking about, like a thesis or a blog post or some conjecture, returns rule the day.
Yeah.
So if you didn't get into that company, it doesn't matter how many times the founder came to your dinner. And I think you got to be prepared to work solo. I think you got to be prepared to self-manage. And then you have to have patience. VC is an interesting profession because you don't know if you're good at it for 7 to 12 years.
Yeah.
What other job can you think of that has that kind of a timeline? You would get fired if you did not perform over, say, a quarter.
That's right. Well, that was one question I had for him, is that VC associate, the idea of a performance review for VC associate is confusing to me, because the evaluation of the performance is an exit 7 to 10 years from now, and they won't be around. What are you talking about in a performance evaluation?
Well, I think that's why there's two schools of thought: very small partnerships, and now what I'll, like this emergence of platform teams.
Yeah.
All the other things that you do around it. And it's fine. And there should be both, right? Andreessen Horowitz has like 300 people that work there.
Yeah.
And I think some firms I can think of have 3. And ultimately, returns rule the day. So platform teams weren't a thing when I started in venture. But now you have this need for ecosystems and workshops and growth and videos and all this kind of stuff. And that makes it for a very interesting role. And then there's the two paths that I just described. One has to do with capital deployment, and one has to do with working at a VC firm and not writing checks.
Yeah.
And I think there's a really clear distinction that's very blurry from the outside.
Yeah, that makes sense. For both of you, first on the angel investment side, like aside from just getting the experience doing it, who are the people or the resources that you feel were really, instructive for you getting better at being an angel investor today?
There are a ton of great resources out there. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, to get better as an angel investor, you just have to, you learn by doing, right? So I think you need to be writing checks, even if they're, I know a lot of folks who kind of got their start just writing $1,000 check, right? Or could join AngelList and start reading through, different memos on that platform. But I think you just gotta get into the flow of information, start taking meetings with founders, right? That said, there's a ton of great content. We mentioned Fred Wilson's blog, which is classic. Naval and his partner had Venture Hacks, which is great. I mean, I think probably a lot of the best content out there these days are podcasts. There are just so many. But, everything from, Turpentine, which Eric Tornberg, who we used to work with, is doing, to, 20 VC. And, I mean, there's just a plethora of content out there. So, I think there's a lot that's out there, but you can only learn so much, by reading or listening. You got to be out there, trying to get mastery, and you got to put in the reps.
Makes sense. How about for you? Instructive people or resources that helped you, get to where you are today?
I have to agree with Sam here. It's like reading a book about swimming.
Yeah.
And then being thrown into a pool. The things you learn from reading the first set of deal docs, from losing the first significant amount of money, because let's be honest, most startups fail.
Yeah.
And that's an easy thing to say up on stage, but then it's really hard when you lose that money.
Yeah.
The relationships you have with founders, how you and they communicate, what it looks like to deal with your life, and then the process they're running for exchanging money. You know, relationships and people change when money is at stake.
Yeah.
And so again, I think there's nothing that is like actually going through the process. And then the thing that I'll share, which I think is important, is yes, these outcomes could be great. Yes, the people you meet and come across could be wonderful, but do not do this if you are not prepared to wait a long time and lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
It is safe to say that one company in a portfolio should return the money you've invested elsewhere and hopefully grow the rest.
Right.
And that probably starts with 10 and probably should be more like 25.
25, yeah.
And so just doing the math on what Sam said is probably outside of a lot of people's safe financial responsibility remit.
Yeah. Has anything changed about like what are the qualities you look for in pre-seed, seed stage founders from, you know, when you were a founder? Anything, because it is access to greater tools. It's easier than ever. You don't have to spend hundreds of $1,000s on data centers.
I tend to back, you know, technical founders or people who are like real builder first mentality, often solving their own problem, right? They've got a real sort of raison d'etre, right? And then it usually, you know, kind of shifts over to the problem that they're going after and the quality of the problem, right? And that kind of dovetails into, you know, is it a hard problem? Is it a problem in a large market, right? Or a market that, you know, small but is growing pretty rapidly? You know, do they have sort of a secret that feels really compelling? You know, it's kind of a lot of these companies that I've invested in, you know, kind of it's either like this sort of magical experience the first time you see the demo, or it's like, you know, you walk away just with so many more questions than you went in with, where it's like, wow, like, you know, this person's just kind of like opened up this whole, you know, new world for me to consider. And then it kind of goes into traction, right? And it's like, okay, what have these people kind of de-risked to date? You know, do I have confidence that they're, you know, able to like really ship product to, you know, put themselves in the customer's shoes? And, you know, what kind of like proof points or data have they accumulated to sort of, you know, prove that narrative?
Potentially reductive question, but it's a follow-up to one thing you said about technical expertise, like being a technical founder, understanding the problem well. If you had to choose, which one do you index more on? That they're a technical founder or they have direct experience with the problem?
It's a good question. I mean, hopefully it's both, but you know, I think at the end of the day, it probably is the problem. You meet a founder who, you know, really just embodies, you know, the thing that they're trying to see in the world, or that's the most important thing.
Last question. Can we talk about crypto for a second? It is not lost on me that New York City is like the financial hub of the world. And it seemed like for a while, crypto, whether it's Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, but then other applications of, you know, blockchain, were promising for the development of New York. Now every panel I go to, somebody makes an NFT joke. Like, what is your current state of crypto? Where does New York go from here in terms of being the land of opportunity for the space? Let's start with you, Eric.
Well, nobody knows. I think, you know, nobody can predict the future, but around 2016, 2017, 2018, there were new forms of non-dilutive capital raising abilities through this idea of an ICO. You could raise money, you could sell a token, you wouldn't have to sell a part of the company. The community could own a piece of the network you were building. I think there's a lot of reasons why those things didn't work. Much like NFTs, probably 99% of those failed. There are some success stories and amazing things that came out of it. In that moment, I think you saw a real shift in terms of the brain power that was moving into the sector. And what I mean by that is marketers, engineers, product people, designers who wanted to work on something that had this promise. It was reinventing something that everyone uses and touches that would, you know, have surface area everywhere. I think that what came out of that, much like startups, is 99% of these things failed.
Yeah.
And there was small 1% that worked. I think now you have established companies, you have publicly traded entities and, you know, assets that are touching like the financial system.
Yeah.
You have a huge amount of people that are interested in building these things, but there's practical applications. And I think that represents like a huge shift from these pie in the sky ideas and sort of the like pushing away of some of these companies and things. And then one thing I'll just pick on New York for, I think there's something like 20 or so bit licenses that have been issued to companies here, which has been a huge just block for companies trying to create, crypto native software or products or services, because they're just hindered by like government regulation that hasn't caught up to where it needs to be, which by the way is not true for a lot of other states.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely bullish in general on crypto, blockchain, Web3. I think, certainly not an original thought, but what kind of gets me excited are we're starting to see more applications where it's sort of like invisible crypto, or the blockchain technology is sort of behind the scenes, right? But it's not obvious, So think, Gen 1, right? It was the Bitcoin, Ethereum. You see mainly just financial and trading applications for these things. But as an example, the other day I signed up for Farcaster using Warpcast, which is, almost like a decentralized version of Twitter, right? And you would sign up for that. You would not really even think, that it was, blockchain powered or something, right? Other than a lot of the conversations still are Web3 related that are happening on it. But those are the types of applications that I, am getting like really excited about. It's easy to kind of like laugh at, people who are buying, $100,000 squiggles or something, thinking that was going to, be something, and not that it won't, but, I think the more interesting thing is the sort of behind the scenes technology there, right? And, whether it's like applications for like online ticketing or something else, and this was kind of just Gen 1, right? And so there's a lot of use cases for NFTs that are not just art. We're just kind of getting started on seeing what those, really special companies could end up being.
It seems to me sort of an observation is like, as most people move out of the space, gravitate towards AI, isn't the job of a VC to look left while others look right? Like the serious folks should by definition still be in crypto, right? So why would the bet not be to just focus on that space?
Well, this is the contrarian thinking, how are you being a contrarian thinker as an investor? But just to go back to what we were talking about around crypto.
Yeah.
My thoughts are that the best companies in the space will have a solution to something without anyone knowing crypto's under the hood.
Got it.
And I think that's true of like apps and services. If you think of the question around gaming, not to use any of these acronyms or anything to do with the Web3 space, imagine playing a video game and not being able to take all the work and effort and digital objects with you into the future versions of that game or somewhere else. It sounds silly, and of course you should be able to do that.
Right.
What enables that to be possible? And I think the answer is a lot of these decentralized blockchain technologies, or not. It'll be the traditional way. But I think people think and use things in terms of like, what solves their problem? If they're a gamer, if they're a trader, if they're interested in like a community or a network, I think the level below it and what enables it might be crypto, but nobody's going to know or care.
Well, Eric, Sam, thanks for joining me. I learned so much. This is great. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.